start with the first session. This will be with Professor Dr. Christine Eriksen. She does her research at the Institute of Geography, University of Bern in Switzerland. She focuses on how people's life experiences of wildfires are shaped by local knowledge, cultural norms, political agendas, and environmental history. Christine's widely published and award-winning work builds on 2 decades of wildfire research in Australia, North America, Europe, and Africa. And she is the author of over 100 articles and 2 books, Alliances in the Anthropocene, Fire Plants and People, and Gender and Wildfire, Landscapes of Uncertainty. So, Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So thank you for the opportunity to share some of my work with you today. It's really exciting to be here. I'm doing sort of a lightning speed overview of 2 different case studies. But before I do that, I'd just like to set a little bit of a context for the broader session today, because that disasters are gendered social experiences is by now a well-established fact amongst disaster researchers, particularly in the social sciences. But what is not always so clear is how gendered dimensions of disasters play out during and before, during, and after an event such as a wildfire. And so in this talk, I will try to unpack some of the entrenched gendered norms and structural biases that continue to inhibit societal capacity to cope with wildfires. So what is gender? Well, from my point of view, the most constructive way to understand gender is not in terms of gender differences, but in terms of gender identities. And as Australian sociologist Eriksen argues, we can't think of womanhood and manhood as fixed by nature, but neither should we think of them simply as imposed from outside by social norms or pressures from authorities. What's really important is that people construct themselves as masculine or feminine, and so we claim a place in the gender order or respond to the place that we are given by the way we conduct ourselves in everyday life. And so in this way, people claim their place or respond to the place they are given in the gender order of the patriarchal structures and masculine traditions of wildfire management, and that impacts status, decision-making, and coping capacity. And this understanding of gender matters for 3 key reasons in wildfire management. It matters because the findings in my research really clearly shows that gender norms structure women's and men's level of risk tolerance and actions in ways that negate other changing social circumstances. It also matters because even when stated policy appears gender aware, institutions reproduce the prevailing values of society more often than they challenge them. And the power dynamics in mixed settings are generally disadvantageous to women. And that's a particular quote from Maureen Fordham. And then thirdly, it matters because most institutions are gendered with internal gender regimes that function in a wider context of gender relations, all of which produce gender effects. And so another quote here by Eriksen is that without even being named as gender, a socially defined masculinity may be built into the very concept of management or organizational rationality. And these gendered norms and structural biases are exacerbated by a lack of awareness of the difference between equality and equity, which often underpins many of the problems encountered by initiatives attempting to address gender inequality. So equality is not the same as equity. Equality only works if everyone starts from the same position, and equity in the form of fair access to the same opportunities is required before we can enjoy equality. And I think this picture of the apple pickers really demonstrates that well. So while equality in the workplace may level the playing field for all genders, it does nothing to improve the condition of the actual field. Improving the conditions of the field with equitable measures is what is required to move towards gender equality. So with these definitions in mind, I'll move on to the first of my two case studies. So one of the findings from my research show that the framing and timing of wildfire warnings have a gendered angle. So my research in Australia and the west coast of the US highlights the increased vulnerability of both women and men because of the activities they tend to perform before, during, and after wildfires. Many women were found to deprioritize wildfire preparations in the context of other pressing issues in everyday life, while societal pressures sees men attempt to perform protective roles when the fire threatens that many have neither the knowledge nor the ability to fulfill safely. And poignant statistics that drive home this message come out of published work that I compare my research with. So when gender dimensions of risk engagement are contextualized in everyday roles and traditions, and then compared with wildfire fatality trends in Australia during the last century, the published literature shows a frightening correlation between women and men's activities at time of death historically and the intended plan of action during wildfires when this particular study was done in 2013. So in short, most women intend to evacuate, and women predominantly die while attempting to shelter or evacuate. And most men intend to stay and defend, and men mostly die outdoors attempting to defend assets. A study I did with some colleagues of the 2009 Black Saturday wildfires highlight that wildfire risk information, engagement, and education initiatives had not managed to curb this trajectory of wildfire fatalities. Our study suggested a number of opportunities for enhancing community wildfire safety. For example, women were found to have reflected more critically on their level of planning and preparedness than men, and that suggests opportunities to develop wildfire awareness and education programs designed specifically to engage and meet the needs of women. Similarly, women were more receptive to advice from relatives, friends, neighbors, and emergency services, suggesting opportunities for tailoring and communicating information, advice, and warnings to women. And people should also be encouraged to plan and discuss the intended responses of all household members, and that includes contingency plans to avoid last-minute disagreements and decisions, because these last-minute disagreements was found to be the cause of a number of fatalities during the Black Saturday fires. Moving on to my second case study, which focuses on the need for cultural change to replace the historical legacy of a toxic workplace culture that harbors gender discrimination and sexual harassment within the wildland firefighting profession. This change is also needed to build a bigger, more cohesive, and therefore stronger workforce that can withstand the pressure placed on it by catastrophic wildfires that we're experiencing more and more frequently. Negotiations of gendered workplace tensions seem to revolve around two troublesome issues. The first is a particular style of firefighting masculinity, which aligns the sex body with a particular understanding of gender. And the second is the notion of a patriarchal gender order, which seemingly positions men and women in the process, men above women in the process of decision-making. And a case study that demonstrates this need for equitable measures is the survey I conducted together with the Association for Fire Ecology in 2015, examining gender discrimination and sexual harassment within the wildland fire profession. So survey participants were asked if they had ever observed or experienced sexual harassment and gender discrimination in their workplace. And half of the respondents had observed gender discrimination, and 35% reported personally experiencing it. Additionally, 25% reported observing incidents of sexual harassment, while 18% reported having experienced it personally. And in all aspects of the survey, women had disproportionately more negative experience to report than men. So almost double the amount of women had personally experienced gender discrimination, and 6 times more women than men had been sexually harassed. And these figures are likely to be an underestimate, as sexual harassment and gender discrimination are known to be underreported by a factor of 3. The majority of respondents in our survey who had experienced sexual harassment, so the 60% in the orange bar there, and the 57% who had experienced gender discrimination, did not report it because of a lack of safe reporting systems. And identified factors that inhibited reporting included fear of job loss, especially for temporary or seasonal employees, fear of retribution or retaliation, fear of being viewed as a victim or as overly sensitive, a belief that harassers would not be penalized, lack of knowledge regarding rights, and accessibility to external support, such as mental health or legal and counseling services. A survey indicated that those who reported being sexually harassed were supported by their manager 58% of the time, and by their organization 53% of the time, but rarely by external agencies or legal intervention. Those who reported gender discrimination received even less support. And for a constructive example of how to break this cycle of non-reporting due to fear of reprisal, we looked to the Canadian Armed Forces, who in 2015 created an external sexual misconduct reporting centre, which removed the initial reporting for sexual harassment and discrimination from the chain of command. And this initiative gave a really clear signal from the organization that they would no longer tolerate the identified, quote unquote, dismissive responses by leadership to sexual harassment and gender discrimination. And it highlights the importance of leadership in taking accountability for ongoing organizational failures in creating a discrimination-free workplace. To gain further insights, one of my students, Rachel Reimer, initiated a study in Canada in 2016 to examine gender and leadership within the British Columbia Wildfire Service. And her study found widespread occurrences of gender discrimination in the day-to-day practice of leadership, and that gender made a difference for wildland firefighters' experiences of normative workplace culture. In their practice of leadership, participants described a trade-off between gender diversity and excellence. And of the 5 key findings from the study listed here on the slide, I want to focus on finding 4 to share the firefighters' suggested action steps towards an ideal future by creating gender equity via excellent leadership. So the firefighters recommended creating a conversation about gender in wildland fire, for example, through leadership training with a greater focus on professionalism and ethics as a targeted way to change workplace culture. Participants also identified a need for collaboration on addressing gender norms because it allows people to work as a team and to hear what other people think. Broader culture in society were also linked to the need for cultural change, as societal norms about traditionally male-dominated professions like wildland fire were seen as a factor in creating the workplace culture as new recruits bring their cultural upbringing with them into the wildland fire. surveys. And there's this quote here by one participant saying, most people growing up, dad's getting the bigger piece of the chicken and he's calling the shots. And that's then following these kids as they grow up and become firefighters. The firefighters also recommended examining the hiring and succession planning process currently in place to ensure that biases are removed. And there were really strong statements cautioning against quotas. So the quote here saying quotas are a chicken shit way of doing it because it means we've failed 100 times leading up to that point. The British Columbia Wildfire Service have never had a preferential hiring practice based on gender, but other wildland fire agencies have. Changing gender norms within the workplace culture was seen in this study as a much more meaningful action step than mechanically putting in higher numbers of females, because despite the lack of a formal preferential hiring practice based on gender, participants identified perceptions that females are favored in an informal quota system. And this highlights an important factor to address, which is latent triggers for resentment towards gender minorities, which speak to the firefighters' recommendation to actively support females in leadership. If support for female firefighters is undertaken separately from conscious engagement with gendered cultural norms, the likelihood of increased resentment towards gender minorities is high. So support for women as a gendered minority must be paired with actions that engage the latent belief that women are favored or are to blame for their own experiences of discrimination and harassment by associating femininity and female bodies with poor work performance. Both the AFE survey and the British Columbia wildfire study concluded that leadership is a key site of interaction between gendered norms and organizational culture within wildland fire. So fostering gender diversity requires transforming leadership practice to dispel myths and latent triggers for resentment of minority groups. Institutions can also start to destabilize the status quo by, for example, rewarding capacities through mentoring programs rather than mateship and the prioritization of technique over physical strength. And this latter point is important as technique is distinct from bodily proficiencies and divorced from the alignment of firefighting masculinity with physical strength. So what I hope these two very brief insights have demonstrated is that when you include gender among your monitoring tools, you get a deeper analysis and can detect inequality and vulnerability issues that were previously either unknown or ignored. So we need to understand that gendered social experiences of wildfire are created and maintained in everyday life, where we make decisions, allocate resources, and create standards. Everyday life is therefore a critical starting place for addressing gender dimensions of wildfire. And with that, I will finish off.
Great, thank you very much, Christine. So we will start with the second presentation, and then we will have time for questions, answers, and comments. We remind all the participants that there is this channel to do your questions or you leave your comments. So Elsa, Elsa Pastor, PhD, she's a professor at the Chemical Engineering Department of Universitat Politècnica de Catalunya, Barcelona Tech, and research scientist at the Center for Technological Risk Studies at the same university. Her work spans various areas related to wildfire management and technological risk analysis. Over the past 2 decades, she has conducted multidisciplinary research combining experimental and modeling techniques to study different aspects of fight behavior and dynamics across various scenarios. Elsa has also led numerous national and European projects with a primary focus on wildland-urban interface risk assessment. Elsa, the floor is yours if you want to share your screen.
Thanks, Mariona. Yeah, I'll try to do so.
Yeah.
And you're going to tell me if you see everything properly. All right. So do you see how I am moving slides?
Yeah, now we
All
can
right.
see it properly.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks to you, Mariona. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start by saying thank you to the Pau Costa Foundation for inviting me to this webinar and join my admired colleague, Christine. Also, I would like to say thank you to my team at CERTEC, which helped me to get this job done, to analyze this women performance in wildfire research. As you may have noticed, we at CERTEC are mostly engineers, mostly women engineers, and you might have the impression that it is weird that we deal with these gender topics because it's not basically our area of expertise. But there is a good reason for that. You know that in our day-to-day work, we come across so many situations in which there is a gender imbalance that unfortunately have become normal. Most of us just don't notice it. But from time to time, people who notice it have enough courage to stand up, to speak up, and to voice their concerns. And this is basically what has been happening in our community during these last years, right? So one of the aims, one of the motivations of that study was to basically give a collective answer, give a collective response to all those individuals that were basically asking us to take action for change. Also, the motivations of that study, another motivation is that it was basically a crystallization of an old idea that came when we were working in Oxford with our colleague and good friend, Ima Oliveras. So during these days, in informal chats and after work discussions, we came out with the idea of doing this work, and we basically outlined the main objectives and the content of this performance analysis of women in our research field, right? So with this study, we are basically fulfilling pending duties, which is also very rewarding. And last but not least, another aim of that study would be to modestly contribute to one of our global challenges as human beings, which is basically promoting diversity and gender equality. So we basically believe that we are somehow taking our part to empower women researchers and particularly young women researchers in our field, right? So with that being said, let me go very quickly through the contents of my presentation. I'll provide you with a bit of introduction of context information. Next, I'm going to go through the materials and methods to perform our study. We had to retrieve a huge amount of data, and I'm very keen on providing you details on that. Then I'm going to show you some results, only part of the results of the overall study, because then we would need another webinar to see them all. And then I will finish with some takeaways. So as you know, wildfire research is mostly related to STEAM disciplines, and it has been already recognized that there is a gender gap in this type of disciplines, right? So basically, according to a recent UNESCO report, the share for female students of bachelor degrees within STEAM disciplines dropped into 41%, right? But this is, as you may know, a country-dependent figure, right? So if we go to US, we can see that they have parity, which is pretty okay. But if we go and look at European Union, that figure drops to 34%, right? So as women move through what is called the leaking pipe of higher education, we see how women are increasingly underrepresented, right? So still in US, women, the share of women making master students in STEAM disciplines drops to 43%, and women enrolled in PhD programs drops to 31%, and then with postdoc contracts, this figure is 36%, right? So this is the leaking pipe of higher education. So overall, that UNESCO report tells us that only the 30% of the world's researchers are women. And you can imagine that within STEM disciplines, this figure might be even lower, right? So statistics also tells us that the number of women in STEM occupations are increasing year by year, but those statistics also tells us that women in STEM fields publish less, are paid less for their research, and do not progress as fast as men in their careers. And this is basically due to the challenge of work-life balance, but also due to the systemic gender bias while hiring, while promoting, while publishing, and while funding, right? However, it has been already recognized that diversity and gender diversity within the scientific force brings unique perspectives, drives creativity and innovation, and provides new context for understanding and applying the research findings, right? And this is particularly true in our field of research, in wildfire research. And as Christina has said, wildfire is a gender unbalanced natural hazard, right? So we can clearly distinguish different gender roles in different activities of the overall wildfire management cycle, right? So we could look at fire agencies, we could look at fire protection consultancy companies, we could look at forestry management, and we could see those gender gaps. But it has already been acknowledged that we as female scientists, we can bring important perspective to wildfire research, which is basically needed to reduce those vulnerabilities and to help closing those gaps. So it turns out that we female researchers can contribute a lot to close those gaps. So with this context, we were very keen basically on understanding the landscape of the wildfire research, on check our organizational structures and the gender distribution within those. We also wanted to look at how we were performing, how we women were performing within this wildfire research community. So we wanted to check at our scholarly output and the impact. And we were also very keen on observing how we were performing in key roles, meaning in international associations, in committees, in being PIs of research projects, in mentoring duties, etc. So basically, we wanted to do that study across geographies, disciplines, and over time, over 50 years of research, which is basically the overall age of our field, right? So with this study, we wanted to answer questions like, are women contributions increasing in our research area? And how are we doing? Are we doing good? Are we doing probably better than men or not? So we wanted to answer this question. So that is why we set up this study. We did a huge amount of work retrieving data. The most important effort was a bibliometric survey, meaning the Web of Science database of abstracts and citations of peer-reviewed papers. But also we did other efforts and strategies. We came up with a questionnaire to researchers. I'm pretty sure that some of you would fill these questionnaires. So thanks again for your help. That was very, very helpful. And we also performed a literature review to put our data under context. And we looked at particular webs, like those containing information about conferences, about committees, about European funded projects, etc. So with all that strategy, we basically constructed our WFR database for us to consider. Now, today I'm only going to present the methods and the results of the bibliometric survey for the sake of time. So as I was mentioning, we mined the Web of Science citation and abstract database. So basically we looked at the published articles, reviews, conference proceedings, books, and book chapters that were published within this 50 years period, written in English. And our filter was basically to filter those papers with the words forest fire or wildfire or wildfire or bushfire in the title or in the abstract. So once we got those papers, we basically constructed our own database with the year, publication type, the title, the abstract, the research categories, the name and country for the first author of the paper, which was basically our proxy for research, and then the name and country of the last author, which was our proxy for research leader, right? And then we wanted to disambiguate the gender of these first authors and last authors. And to do so, because of course, the Web of Science doesn't contain that information, we used Gender IPI, disambiguation tool, which is basically an application that helps you to classify gender of a name according to the origin, to the country of origin, right? We could only retrieve 2 gender options. Of course, we understand that this might be too simplistic, but we could not go further. So we basically understood names as, male gender or female gender. And from that Web of Science, we could also retrieve data from top authors, in that case from top 50 authors, basically being those authors with highest number of papers and number of sites. So overall, we basically retrieve 23,000 documents with 16,000 first authors coming from 128 countries. So not at all bad, a huge amount of information to look at. Now, I'm going to show you some of the results. Basically, we had the opportunity to get this overview of wildfire research, analyzing all this huge amount of papers. And then after that, we're going to put our gender glasses on, and we will try to figure out how are we doing in terms of these first authors. So what's the proportion of women within the overall landscape? How, again, proportions and figures of last authors being research leaders, and then we will analyze top authors. So as I was saying, this overview of wildfire research, we could retrieve these almost 23,000 papers over the years. Most of them were journal papers together with conferences. And we could see, this exponential increase of publications, being 2/3 of the overall papers published during this last decade, and only 1/4 being published during the last decade, right? In terms of research categories, we found that physical sciences papers are basically 2/3 again of the overall production, followed by engineering and technology papers, which is basically 1/4 of the overall production. And then we also found papers dealing with life sciences, social sciences, and humanities, and health sciences. And today, for the sake of time, I'm only present paper results dealing with physical sciences and engineering and technology, because engineering, of course, it's my field, my area of expertise. So looking at the first author continent, we saw that basically production comes mainly from North America and from Europe. It takes a huge amount of the cake, right? And we could also see how the trends in terms of different disciplines, in terms of different categories within continents. So we could observe, for instance, how social sciences and humanity research is quite an important topic in Oceania, so basically in Australia, so because it has the largest share compared to all the different continents. And we could also see how in Asia, engineering and technology research is very, very important. So those results were not surprising because, since I was working in Australia for a while, I could basically detect how important these social science and humanities works are there. So, it wasn't surprising to us, but still, I was very happy that our data could show those trends, right? Now, in terms of citations per research area, we could find how physical science papers have a huge amount of citations, right? The papers with more citations, we could see how that increasing trend over time. We just need, 10 more years to see this figure, this average figure, just pretty much up here. And then in terms of papers with engineering and technology, they are less cited, but again, this is normal because there is not a huge amount of papers of that. So those are the trends in terms of citations. But again, from engineering technology, there are papers very highly cited, with sites more than 2,000 sites, which is quite good, right? Now, if we put our gender filter on, then we're going to be able to analyze where we women are. So from all our database, from all our first authors, we could observe that from all those 23,000 papers, only the 28% were basically had basically a woman as first author, and we could basically observe the trend of that over the years. So if we look at the current data, we can see how researchers are basically 32% are basically women. So remember that UNESCO figure that I just showed you, which is basically 30%. So we are pretty much almost there, right? Considering all research categories within the wildfire research arena, women are basically the 32%. Again, researcher as, first author of a paper as a proxy for researcher. Now, in terms of continents, we could see how in Asia, the rate of women is basically less than in any other continent, whereas in South America, researchers in wildfires, 40% are women. So this is quite good. And if we look at research categories, we could see that women working in engineering and technology, from the overall landscape of researchers, we are only at 21%, right? And health sciences have 40%, so it's almost the double of the figure of women. again, this was not surprising to us. We know that we women in engineering, we are quite a minority, right? Now, in terms of differences for citations, we observed all those papers in which the first author was a man, and then the first papers in which the first author was a female for physical sciences, right? So we could not really discover differences. I could not say that this plot, the left-hand side plot from the right-hand side plot are significantly different. But then we looked at the papers in engineering technology, and then we could see how we women are performing a bit better looking at these indicators. So our papers, even that we have less papers, are more cited. It's just a slight difference if you want, but I can see the difference in here. So these figures, are higher than these figures over here, right? So we are, basically more cited than men. Now we've looked at the leadership role, analyzing the last authorship. We could see that we women leading research projects, we are just around the 21%. Currently, these days, we could observe how this trend was increasing over time, together with the decreasing trend of papers with only one author, right? Because back in the days, people would not have the means of working together with other teams, but now this trend is just decreasing. So currently, we might say that women in leadership roles are around 20%. And again, if we go and look at the engineering field, which is my field, that's less than that, that's 17%, right? Now, before showing you more information, more data, I would like to share an inner thought, an inner feeling with you, because during these 20 years of career, I've always had the feeling that there might be some type of natural sisterhood between women. So even if it is unconscious or unplanned, there is a sense of mentorship between women. So a strong sense of responsibility, I would say, between us. But this is a feeling. This was a feeling. I had that feeling during my whole career since I was a young researcher up to now. And I wanted to see whether our data would reflect that. And I think we found it. So the idea was basically to plot the papers in which the last author was a woman, so women leading that research. And we could observe how from those papers, the 36% had the first author a woman, right? Whereas from those papers in which the last author was a man, so research projects led by men, women as first author were only at 28%. So 8 points of difference. So to me, this is a significant difference. So this is showing probably this sisterhood between women that I was mentioning, or mentorship duties, or some sort of aggregation effect. I'm not sure exactly what it means, but it's quite something. And we would need, social scientists to dig in a little bit more on that. But this is what our data was showing. And this information of this trend was also clearly distinguished between categories, between research categories. So again, 8 points of difference in engineering and technology, and even 10 points of difference in health sciences, right? So that's something there, right? This mentorship type of duty and sense of responsibility between us, between women is there. Now, just to finish, let me mention you and let me show you some data on top authors. So we retrieved the top 49 authors from our database, which were authors with a higher number of papers, more than 40 papers. And we could see that from those 49 authors, only 12% were women, with the first position occupied by a woman being the 14th position. And another indicator of women in leadership roles would be, the average number of sites of researchers being women. So from those top 50 authors, we could find that 28% of those were women, with the first position occupied by a woman being the 7th, right? So just time to wrap up, because I would like also to discuss all that with you guys and to receive, all that feedback. So with that study, we could basically check how gender diversity brings those new perspectives and drives creativity and helps to reduce fire vulnerability. And we've observed, however, over these 50 years of research, there is evident a gender gap in our field. So we are basically these 32% of researchers overall being women engineers, a clear minority. we have discovered, we have put evidence on that we publish fewer papers, but there might be slightly larger cited in particular research areas. And for leadership practice, women in leadership roles are around 20%. I have more indicators of that. I don't have time to show you now this information, but again, this is basically lower, 20%. And the last message that I would like to give is that to promote diversity and gender equality, it's everyone's responsibility. So you can take action for change at any opportunity that you have. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Elsa and Christine. Probably, Christine, if you can turn on your camera, we can see you. Great. So I cannot see any questions on the chat.
I'm happy to start with one for Elsa.
Right.
Okay, great.
So thank you for a really interesting talk. I thought that was super interesting. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about it at some point.
Thanks.
So a couple of comments, which is, I know the social science total was only 3.5% of all your papers, so it's a small section of it. But one of the thing that kind of is quite distinct between the social sciences and the natural sciences is that the last author is rarely the lead project manager. So they don't have that hierarchical breakup. And so by focusing on first and second author, you might get really different findings if you look just on the social sciences. But also, again, if you're looking at the first author and the first author is actually the lead, then you might find something else. And then my second comment was so interesting, your reflection on this kind of potential sisterhood amongst female researchers. And playing devil's advocate, it is also possible that women just do what men have done for the past 50 years, which is that they reflect themselves into the people they like to either employ or work with. So it's kind of that mirror thing that is the problem with hiring committees, right? If it's all men on the hiring committee, the likelihood of them hiring a man that is similar to them is like greatly increased. And is it possible that women do that too? I don't know. I'm just putting it out there.
Thanks for those very interesting questions, Christine. The first one, so the leading role of women being the last author in papers, we are aware that that might be different in the different categories, but we took that idea from gender reports dealing with types of studies, of research studies. So. And again, we checked other indicators. I haven't had time to go through these. So we checked, for instance, the European Union database on funded European projects, funded research projects. And we could see how that figure of PIs being women was very, very low. And the share of the budget that we research leaders could get from the European Union was ridiculously low compared to the huge amount of money that men are taking. So we had other indicators, but yeah, I acknowledge that point that it's not always, reflecting the reality when we looked at this last authorship role, right? But we took the idea from different type of reports of gender analysis. So that's for the first question. And then for the second question, that's a very good point. I like that you want to play that role of being the devil's advocate, but I guess that you put it very well in your talk. It's about equity, I guess, right? It's about equity. So I guess that we have in our feelings and in our souls that impression that we should basically contribute to equity. So that's basically, we try to help us very much because we know that there might be other forces pushing down. So we want to, to combine forces to push up our female scientists, right? So I guess that it's about equity. It's not that we are doing the same roles. I mean, I have a point in my career where I am really doing this type of mentorship with our students and with our young researchers. And I believe that I do the same type of job when I have a man or a woman in under my responsibility. But again, I guess that there is something there. There is this aggregation. At least our data is showing this, right? And I've always had that feeling that even when I was a young researcher, and now that I'm a senior researcher.
Great. We have a question from Judith Kishner. Judith, hello. Go ahead.
Evening.
Good evening.
Thank you both for sharing your research. It's been very interesting, and I could also recognize a lot of this in my own context of research in like wildfires. And so I was reflecting on where would be a good starting point on learning more about how to change things. And I was wondering if you have like an idea of like a country where there's a lot happening, or like a specific field of disasters other than the case studies that we just heard. Thank you.
It's a hard question to me. I'm an engineer. I'm not a social scientist. So maybe Christina could take this one.
Well, ironically, I think if you look to Australian fire researchers, you see an example of how about probably since the early 2000s, there's been a real push to educate the new generation of fire researchers. And that has very consciously been more or less a gender balanced push. And that shows now in the people who are now the more senior roles. I'm one of those that came out of that system, but I'm by no means the only one. And so I think that's also one of the important things to remember, is that even when we start to instigate change, it might take the best part of 15, 20 years before you see the real benefits of it, because Elsa and I are in the fortunate positions that we have stayed with it. We stayed with all the trouble for all the years, and now we're in a position to try and give back, to try and actually implement these equitable measures. And so that's something I think we will see more and more as we go forward, is that change will happen just because there's been a generational shift, whether that's within research or whether it's within emergency services, the different practitioner groups. But certainly, I think the social sciences historically have a record of being more equitable than the natural and the engineering sciences.
Great. We have a question from Lucia, or another question, or yeah, go ahead, Lucia, and then Adelmut.
Yes, hello. I'm very interested in your personal experiences, if you can share. So I don't know if there is anything you can add from your personal experience, or maybe your colleagues, something that they might have told you or share with you. Thank you.
Well, myself being an engineer, being a minority during my whole, professional career has been challenging. I have to tell you that. I wouldn't say that I've been suffering, so that's not how I would put it. But I have the feeling that myself and my colleagues, female colleagues, we have had to push a lot and to work a lot to get with the same conditions as men have quite easily, right? So this is something common in an engineering school, in an engineering type of university. But of course, I've also detected that things are changing, and basically because there is this overall environment that equity should be promoted, and not only gender diversity, but all sorts of diversity should be acknowledged and accepted and integrated within our research organizations and communities. So I clearly see a change in that. So hopefully next generations won't have to work that hard as we did to get to the same position as men would have.
Thank you, Elsa.
I think one of the reflections I would like to make there is about, so one of the things that many female firefighters shared with me during interviews is how when they came up through the ranks, it was actually often if there was a single woman who had somehow made it through the glass ceiling and had made a senior position, they could be actually much more of an obstacle to younger females progressing. And it was almost like it was that sense of, well, I did it the hard way, so you'll have to do it the hard way too. And I don't think that's unheard of, even if it's not amongst firefighters, but in academia too. But what they did say, and which is certainly also my personal experience, is that mentors are incredibly important in all of this. And so I was very fortunate that throughout my career, I've had incredible mentors. Some of them have been women, but the majority have been men, because predominantly it's been men who have been in the positions where they've been able to help me open doors. And often what they have done is literally open a door and hold it for me. I then had to make my own way into the room, but certainly the ability to get into the room was greatly advanced. And then there's this very ironic thing that sometimes I actually think it's a real benefit to be a woman in this field, because you are kind of assumed from the get-go that you might be not quite as smart as your male colleagues, or certainly when you are a student, you might not. And so more often than I care to think, I've been out working in rural communities, I've been in fire centres working with different fire managers, and I can tell that they belittle me until they realise what I do, what the work is I do, how I operate. I prove them wrong. And once they realise that, they remember me. And they remember you because you stood out as the one they belittled. And so in some ways, even though it can be hard to get through the glass ceiling, sometimes you get at least up to the glass ceiling higher because the expectations of you from the get-go are lower. And so there's some weird, ironic things going on there.
Thank you, Christine.
So, Adelmot.
Hello.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Dr. Christine, you mentioned transformative leadership as a possible intervention to change some of these gender dynamics. And one of the things that my research has shown is just how isolated wildland firefighters are in the US, and how the fact that they're always changing and always moving and experiencing high rates of burnout makes certain interventions, unless someone is directly there with them, not very feasible. So how would you create a transformative leadership intervention that kind of has that power to stick, and kind of has that bottom-up power? Because it's been, my research has shown that interventions are just not taken up very easily unless the leaders are really motivated. And because most of the leaders are men, they're not going to talk about gender dynamics before a role, for example.
That's a really great question. Thank you for that. I think at the end of the day, it comes down to structural inequality. And so leaders can be in a really difficult position to implement these sort of transformations because there's no temporal security for the firefighters. And so you put your finger right on the soft spot of all of this, is that they don't have any job security. It's seasonal more than anything. But what comes on top of that for many wildland firefighters is that it's not just that they have seasonal employment, they have no health benefits, they have no insurance, they have no sick leave, they have no, like, whatever it is that we in permanent positions take for granted, they do not have. And so I know there's some really strong grassroots initiatives happening, lobbying for safety and equitable measures to go in and be a foundation. And I think that is probably the starting point, I would think, because once you have a basis where you say, well, yes, all firefighters have a right to sick leave and injury compensation if they're injured on the job, then even if they are only employed for 6 months in that role, if they have that during those 6 months, they will also then continue to have that treatment after it. And so if that's the case, it means that leaders have more room to breathe because they're not constantly pushed against the wall either, right? So it makes it complex because you need both structural change at the same time as you need transformational leadership. And often it's the transformational leaders that enable the structural change as well. So we really need to work from both top down and bottom up.
Thank you.
Well, we don't have more comments or questions right now. I only wanted to say that we were 19 participants, 15 were women and 4 were men. This is another question, no? How to engage these people that are not engaged in this situation or that see the situation as us. How should we engage people that are not committed with this needed change? Do you have an answer to that? How can we engage these people?
I can try a quick answer. I can see we also have another hand, but so one of the ways that I go about my gendered research is I rarely name the project as a gendered research project. It's about all sorts of other things, but gender is one element in there. But if you tell people, so when I initially did my research where there was some very strong voices coming out of the female participants, and I thought, oh, great, I'll go and do the same sort of interviews with male firefighters, so I have comparisons, and I just could not get buy-in, because if you sell it to them as a gendered research project, they're not going to participate necessarily. And I think really, like, just the questions we just had about like burnout and kind of suicide rates among male firefighters, and kind of the difficulty of men actually finding a kind of a sustainable work-life balance is one way to get them engaged, because if you focus on that rather than gender, you're still going to have the gendered element in there, but you're going to get many more of them coming to the table, would be my guess.
Thank you. I will give the voice to Sisula. Hello, Sisula. And this will be, sorry, Sisula, the last question, because we have to end.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I just want thanks to Elsa and Christine for the wonderful presentation. I just want to share my experience about women. I work in the Hellenic Fire Service. I'm a Fire Lieutenant Colonel. I work here for the last 22 years. There is really a problem with that. I think that we need a lot of things to do in future. The only thing I do when I go to meetings or to conferences, or I say we need more women here. The most people I see, it's all men. Okay, maybe I will be only me. But the thing I do is when I see them, I ask for more women to come, and I would like to share an experience. During this fire season, we had some help from the USA military defense, military of defense, and we had a meeting in the morning with 10 people. All of them were men, and when I met them, I said, "No woman." No woman here. And they heard, the general heard that. And then we had a meeting again in the afternoon. And a woman came. And he said, I am here because of you. And this is really happy for me and a very good experience that we must try, even us, to be more women, more voices. And I share this positive feeling of Elsa and Christine, and I think it's really important because we are going to change that, not the men.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Well, I think that with these final comments and Zula, we can close this webinar. It was a pleasure to have you, Elsa and Dr. Christine. It was really great to hear your findings and your personal experiences. I hope that these studies will move on and you will have more results to share and show in next webinars or conferences. Thank you very much. That's all. Have a good afternoon or a good day. Bye.
Bye-bye.